All right, hello everyone again. This is going to be the part 2 video of our oligopoly market structure. So hopefully you've already seen the first one. If you have not, make sure you pause now, go back and watch it so that this makes sense. But we are still in oligopolies, and as we talked about earlier, this is our third market structure. So the first one was perfect competition, which, if you remember, was defined as many firms all producing a similar product. And then we looked at our second one, which was monopolies, which is one firm that dominates the entire market. So they are the whole show. They supply everything and all the demand runs through them. And so because of that, monopolies have a lot of market power, right? They can flex their economic muscles a little bit and have higher prices and therefore more profit. And then we've been now talking about oligopolies, which is, just as a quick recap, defined as a few firms, and we've talked about duopolies as the most common, at least for our intents and purposes. And these firms have to work together in order to understand what their actions are going to be. They are not they are not on an island. They are interdependent from one another. They're not independent. They have to use the other person's actions in accounting with their own. So it's a very unique situation. Again, there's really not any graphing that we do with it. But what we've discussed in the previous video is that they produce less. An oligopoly market structure produces less than a perfectly competitive one, but the output is greater than a monopoly structure. So the more closely they can work together, the better the outcome, the higher the profit. However, today we are going to see that one thing does stand in their way, which prevents them from working together. And that one thing is what we call game theory. So if you recall from your reading, game theory is essentially the study of how people behave in strategic situations. So this can be applied many times in many different ways. When you go off to college, you may encounter game theory in a number of different type of majors or minors. You can see this in political science. You can see this in business and accounting. You can see this in psychology, certainly. You can see this in a number of different ways. But game theory is going to hold true. And really what we're talking about are decisions in which one economic actor or one firm, when they are deciding what action they want to do, what price should they charge for something, they must, and I've put this in red here for you to see it, they must consider how others might respond to that action. Okay, so let me say that one more time. When they are deciding what they themselves want to do, what price should I charge, how much output should I do, they have to consider how others may respond to that. Okay, so this goes back all the way to what we talked about earlier, which was how do gas stations respond to a competitor's price change, right? So we've talked about why are there gas stations that are across the street from each other. The reality is that I, as a gas station owner, can't change my pricing without assuming that the gas station across the street will see it and respond to it. So it is interdependent. Because the number of firms in an oligopoly market, because it's small, they have to know that their profit depends not only on how much it produces, but also how much the other firms produce. So I'm going to pause here just for a moment, and you can continue writing these down if you're taking notes, but I want you just to remind yourself that the profit, the goal of a firm, no matter what type of market structure it is to maximize profits. We've discussed that already. However, for an oligopoly, they are not solely responsible for their own profits. Okay, that sounds kind of weird, right? We've talked about other industries, especially monopolies, where they can decide what price they want and they can know how much profit they can receive. With an oligopoly, my profit is dependent on not just what I make, but it's going to be dependent on how much my competitors also produce and also their pricing. So this is really the foundational aspect of game theory. It's really strategical gamesmanship of trying to outguess and outstrategize your competing firms. Your textbook talked about the prisoner's dilemma as an example of how difficult it is to maintain cooperation. And it really is a good, helpful illustration of how oftentimes firms will fail to cooperate with one another, even if that cooperation would make everyone better off. So go ahead and read that second bullet again and just kind of consider that. Often firms will fail to cooperate with one another, even if the cooperation would make them better off. Well, that seems strange, you might think. Why wouldn't they cooperate? If it makes them better off, why wouldn't they cooperate? Well, let me give you the prisoner's dilemma analogy to kind of help you. Essentially, what the prisoner's dilemma is this. You have two thieves or some type of criminal that get captured, and they are put into two different cells at the police station. So they're not near each other. And they are questioned separately. And they have two options, right? If you imagine yourself, think of yourself as one of those criminals, and you are in one of the cells, and you are being interrogated by the police officers. And you've got two choices. You can either admit that you did the crime, or you can remain silent, right? Now, you have to be thinking about two things. Number one, you are trying to determine your own course of action, right? Should you confess or not? However, you have to realize that it's not just your decision making. You have to also be thinking about your partner who's in the other cell, right? Because if you confess and they don't, then that is a different outcome. What if you don't confess, but they do confess, right? What if you both confess? What if you both don't confess? So what I'm getting at is that this particular game is going to show us how it is difficult to maintain a mutually beneficial course of action because you have to try to do what is in your best interest, given the other person's actions. I'll go back here really quickly. All right, let's start with Clyde. All right, if Clyde decides to confess, Bonnie has two choices here. All right, ignore the bottom row there. You're just looking at the top two squares, right? Let's say Clyde confesses. Bonnie has to decide, hey, if Clyde confesses, I can do one of two things. I can confess and get 8 years, or I can remain silent and get 20 years. Well, which one sounds better to you? If you were Bonnie, would you rather get 8 years in jail or 20 years in jail? Well, that's pretty easy. Clearly, Bonnie would rather confess. All right, so let's say Clyde remains silent. All right, so now we ignore the top row. Just look at those bottom two boxes. Clyde decides to remain silent. Bonnie, once again, has the same two options. Do I confess and go free? Or do I remain silent and get 1 year in jail? Well, what is the better course of action? Clearly, Bonnie would rather go free than have 1 year in jail. So what I'm getting at is this. Irregardless of Clyde's actions, Bonnie should do what, everyone? Think to yourself, what should Bonnie do? The answer is Bonnie should confess. Because if Clyde confesses, her best course of action is to confess. If Clyde remains silent, her best course of action is still to confess. All right? And because these numbers are a mirrored image of each other, it would be the same for Clyde. So both Clyde and Bonnie are going to have a dominant strategy of confessing. This is why they will never both remain silent. Even though that's the best option for the two of them, combined, as individual actors, they both will confess because that is their dominant strategy. All right, let me move forward here again. Let's do a couple more examples quick. We have Jack and Jill. All right, they're going up the hill to get a pail of water. If Jack and Jill both decide to go to the well and have high production of water. Jack gets $1,600 of profit and Jill gets $1,600 of profit if they both have a high production. What if Jack decides to do low production but Jill stays with a high production? Well, look at what happens to our profit. Jack's profit goes down a little bit and Jill's increases to $2,000. Now, if we say that Jack does high production but Jill does a low production, Jack now has higher profit, Jill now has $1,500 of profit. So let's talk about what if they both decide to do low production, 30 gallons apiece. They both decide to go low. Well, Jack is going to get $1,800 of profit, and Jill will get $1,800 of profit. So if you were to ask yourself, and I'm going to pause here for a moment, I want you to think about it. What option is the best for Jack and Jill together? If they were to work as a team, what is the best course of action? Well, of course, as we look at it, what is the net worth? Well, if they both have high production, the top left box, together, collectively, they can make $3,200. All right, if they are at a low and a high production, the most that they can get together is $3,500. But if they are to both do low production, they will make a collective amount of $3,600. So clearly that bottom right corner is their best option. My question to you is this: does Jack have a dominant strategy? Does Jack have a dominant strategy? Is there one way that one action that Jack should do regardless of what Jill does? Well, if Jill does high production, so that top row again, we're ignoring the bottom row now, but if Jill does a high production, Jack can either make $1,600 for high or $1,500 for low production. Clearly, Jack would rather have the high production. Well, now let's go to the bottom two rows. If Jill decides to have low production, Jack would rather have $2,000 with high production than low production of $1,800, wouldn't he? So Jack's dominant strategy is going to be high production. And what we're going to see is that that's going to be the same for Jill as well. So this brings us to something that we need to pay attention to. Self-interest makes it difficult for oligopolies to maintain a cooperative outcome with low production. Low production, high prices, and monopoly profits would happen if they could work collectively and cooperate, but the problem is that self-interest makes that very difficult. Just a couple other ones. You can do this without actual numbers. Let's just talk about the Cold War a little bit. All right, really quickly. You've got the United States, you've got the Soviet Union, and they have options. Do we arm ourselves with nuclear weapons or do we disarm? If you remember during the 80s, that was a big deal with Reagan, and Gorbachev was reducing their nuclear arms. Okay, well, let's look at this quick. If both the United States and the Soviet Union decide to increase or to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, both of them are at risk, right? Because, hey, my enemy has nuclear weapons, even though I do. It doesn't matter if I shoot the nukes off first. If there are more nukes coming towards my country, we both are at risk. It doesn't matter who launches first, right? Well, if the United States decides to disarm, as maybe they promised to do, you can see that if the Soviet Union still arms themselves with nukes, look at the US. We are at risk and we're going to be weak, right? And if we disarm our nukes, but the Soviet Union decides to arm them, you can see that the Soviet Union is going to be not only safe, but in a position of power. All right? Well, the same is going to be true if we jump to the other direction. If the United States decides to arm ourselves, we will be safe and powerful. And if the Soviet Union disarmed, they would be at risk and weak. Maybe you're seeing a trend here. And then ultimately, what if both Gorbachev and Reagan decide that it is best if we get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, all of them are gone, neither country has any single nuke? well then not only is both the US and the Soviet Union safe, but I think you could argue that the whole world would be safer for that. Clearly, that is the best option. But as we've seen earlier, because of dominant strategy, will either the Soviet Union or the US ever get rid of their nuclear weapons? No, of course not, because arming themselves is always going to be the dominant strategy. One last one for you. I'm just going to put these up here and I want you to take a look at them. You've got two oil companies. You have Exxon and you have Chevron. I'm just going to put the numbers up here and I want you to decide. Does Chevron have a dominant strategy, and if so, what is it? If Chevron has a dominant strategy, and if so, what is it? All right, let's take a look at it. What should Chevron do regardless of what Exxon does? Well, let's start with if Exxon decides, so in the blue triangles there, if Exxon decides to drill 2 wells. So what does that tell you? That means ignore that right-hand column, right? We're not looking at rows right now, we're looking at columns. Ignore the entire right-hand column, we're just looking at the left-hand squares. If Exxon drills 2 wells, Chevron has 2 choices. They drill 2 or they drill 1. Which one would they rather do, everyone? Clearly, they would rather drill 2 wells and make $4 million of profit. All right, so that's good, but let's talk about if Exxon drills 1 well. So let's look at just the right-hand boxes. Well, Chevron still has the same option. Would they rather make $6 million with 2 wells, or would they rather have $5 million of profit with 1 well? Well, the answer, of course, is going to be they still want to drill 2 wells. So Chevron's dominant strategy is going to be to drill 2 wells. Even though low output and a higher profit would happen if they were able to have collusion and to work together, but they won't cooperate because of their dominant strategies. I want to point out one thing quick. Dominant strategies are very common when it comes to oligopolies. However, be careful. It is very possible that one of them might have a dominant strategy and the other one does not. It is possible that neither of them have dominant strategies. That is an entirely plausible reason. In our cases that we've looked at today, they have. That's just because we're kind of learning it and getting our feet under us. But just remember, it is entirely possible that they could not have a dominant strategy. So let's wrap this up a little bit. Why do people sometimes cooperate? Well, firms that care about future profits will cooperate because they know essentially they are going to be competing in this same game repeatedly, right? Rather than cheating once or twice, they are going to say, hey, I am competing with this oil company every single year for the next 50 years. So it is actually better to cooperate. So sometimes that can happen. Oftentimes the profit margins are just too big and it won't. But it's possible that they know, hey, I know I'm competing with just one other person and it's going to be competing with them for a long time. For example, Pepsi and Coca-Cola are famous for this. They've kept prices at a reasonable rate because they know that their profit is going to be higher than if they both try to outbid one another. So sometimes they can cooperate. Now, as the number of firms in the industry, in the oligopoly go up, as we maybe have 6 or 7 oligopoly firms in the same industry, clearly cooperation gets harder and harder and harder. So self-interest becomes more prevalent. Because they care about future profits, they will often not cheat on their agreement because no future agreement can be maintained. Right? If you break your word and if you cheat on something once, I'm not going to trust you again in the future, and then we're both down profit that we could have if we did work together. And so cooperation among oligopolists is undesirable from the standpoint of society because it leads to production that is too low and prices that are too high. Ladies and gentlemen, this is very similar to deadweight loss, right? Just like an oligopoly, or excuse me, just like a monopoly. Production can be too low, prices can be too high when they cooperate. There's not enough competition. So that's oligopolies. We can practice more. Hopefully you can spend some time. Make sure you go back and look at the readings, do the practice questions, and just remind yourself of how oligopolies function. Understand dominant strategy. Understanding Nash equilibrium, how to find it on a game matrices is going to be important. All right, everyone.